Thanks for coming with me today, Father. Evening prayer for peace. Tonight is no ordinary night. It's a precious break at the conclusion of a day that God has already been through with you. Before you sleep, before you think of tomorrow, before you think of what went wrong or what is yet incomplete, take this moment and remember the Father has been with you. From the very first rays of dawn that crept into my room, you were there. You were the gentle breeze that awakened me, and the strength that gave me the resolve to rise. Amidst the rush and preoccupations of the day, when fierce winds threatened to uproot my confidence, you were the rock on which I leaned. When my thoughts wandered through the mazes of decisions and the pressures of work, you were the light that illuminated my path. Thank you, my Father, for never leaving me for a single moment as prey to anxiety, but for being my hidden support, the faithful companion who holds my hand before my foot can slip. And now, as the curtain of night falls and your stars are revealed in the sky, I raise to you my evening prayer, a prayer for peace. The peace that this world, burdened by wars and conflicts, so desperately lacks. The peace that weary and anxious souls search for. O Father of peace, send your peace that surpasses all understanding to descend upon my heart first. Grant me the inner peace that calms the roaring storms within me, the peace that makes my soul a sanctuary of tranquility. Extinguish with your peace the fires of resentment that may be burning in my chest without my knowing, and wash away with the water of your mercy any malice or bitterness that accumulated during the day. I also ask that you pour out your peace upon this broken world, for every city torn apart by shells, for every child sleeping without a cradle, and for every mother who has shed a tear over her loss. I cry out to you, O Lord, have mercy and grant your peace. Make this night of ours a cradle for human reconciliation, for forgetting the wounds of the past, and for starting a new page written with the ink of love and compassion. The peace I pray for is not merely the absence of noise or the end of war, but that sacred presence that fills the void. That profound reassurance that envelops the soul when it knows with certainty that you are the sovereign God, and that you are the shepherd who never slumbers. As the night deepens and human voices fade away, nothing remains but the sound of my heart beating with your remembrance. In this sacred silence, I offer my night prayer. The night is a time of secrets, a time for open conversation with you without veils, a time to strip away the masks we wear for people during the day. O my Father, sleep is a miniature image of death, a complete surrender to your will. And now, as I lay my head on my pillow, I surrender entirely to you. I entrust to you my spirit, my thoughts, my body, and my tomorrow. I place in your hands all the worries of the day that I was unable to resolve, and all the troubles that weighed heavily upon my shoulders. Take them, Lord, for they have no place in your presence. I ask in this night prayer that you protect me from every evil and every dark thought. Guard my going out and my coming in, and keep my loved ones safe in their various places. Remember, O Lord, everyone spending this night in vigil, the patients in pain, the travelers on the roads, and the watchmen guarding our safety. Place your gentle hand upon them, and grant them a portion of rest and tranquility. Make this night O my Lord, a teacher that teaches me silence, so that in its quietness I may listen to the whispers of your Spirit. Teach me that the darkness does not frighten you, and that night and day are the same to you, both echoing with your praise. Purify my heart from any daytime sin, and wash me with the water of your grace, so that I may wake up tomorrow like a bride prepared to meet her bridegroom. Thank you, my Father, for accompanying me today. And just as you walked with me through the busy hours of the day, I pray that you accompany me through the quiet hours of the night. Hold my hand as I close my eyes. Be the last thought I entertain before sleep overtakes me, and the first joy I awaken to with the rising of the new dawn. In your holy name, in the name of your unchanging love, in the name of your peace that surpasses all understanding, I pray and give thanks. Amen.